Good afternoon, friends. I am the Reverend Dr. Mary Biedron, Senior Minister of North Congregational Church, and this is Lenten Lecture, Lenten Teaching Time number 2 for 2022, the second of 4 explorations into how to approach the Bible, and particularly the very complicated story of John's Gospel. So today, we're going to think about reading John's Gospel and about the images of light and sight. Now, as you probably know, there are 4 gospel stories in the Bible, 4 versions of what is the same story, except that they're not the same. And so the choice was made by the early church to keep these 4 as standalones and put them all together. So it's important to read all the gospels because while they tell the story of Jesus, they do it in very different ways. The first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means seen with the same eye. And they tell the same basic sequential story, the story of the parables, the birth narrative, all of those things. The Gospel of Mark was actually the earliest and dates from about AD 66, so about 36 years after all of the things that happened in Jesus' life. Matthew and Luke come later, AD 85 to 90, and they use Mark as source material. And this is part of what makes them synoptic. They have many of the same stories with almost the same wording, perhaps arranged a little bit differently with some extra material glossed in depending on their specific audiences. In these synoptic gospels, as I say, you find the birth narratives, you find the parables, you find the sayings of Jesus, you find Jesus instituting the act of communion. You find many different things that are completely familiar to us, the Beatitudes, many things. The Gospel of John, which was written much later, the earliest possible date seems to be 90 AD and possibly as late as 110, comes after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, after the Jews have been scattered and the Jewish faith has been undone. The Romans made good on their promise to conquer and finally to disperse the people who were not obedient under their rule. They came into Jerusalem, they tore down the temple. Their little west wall was left standing under the rubble. They salted the ground. They prevented any Jews from coming near. And this faith that had been centered on temple sacrifice became instead a faith of rabbinic teaching in synagogues. So there's a big change in Judaism. And of course, there's also a big change in Christianity. Up until that time, Christianity was still understood as a sect of Judaism. And in many cases, the early Christian church struggled with, did you have to be Jewish in order to be Christian? After this time, and in the time into which John is writing this story about Jesus, the two have come apart. The Jerusalem church is gone and scattered. The church is centered in Rome, and the identity of Christians is becoming something very different. Indeed, John is very focused on identity, of Jesus' identity, on the apostles' identity, on the identity of all the people who are the followers of Jesus, and also our identity as followers of Jesus. The parables are gone, there's a different timeline, and it is written instead for the use by a church that included many Gentile Christians, Christians who had never been Jewish, Christians who were not from the ancient Middle East, Christians like most of us. This includes many pieces of scripture and many references, many discussions that are actually thought to be ancient hymns to Christ. And I'm going to read to you one of them, which is the very beginning of the book of John. This is something that we look at Christmas time when we want to proclaim the idea of light and life. And it is something that is important to us in our own times. And the teacher should have had the page marked. All right, from John 1 through 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. Now, this is not the evangelist. This is John the Baptist. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He testified that he was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world, to Jesus. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become the children of God, born not of blood or of the will of flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, his light, the glory as of Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law, indeed, was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. And that is from the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. At that beginning, in that beginning part of that hymn to Christ, we see the theme of light. We see what God is revealing into the world, and we see the theme of sight, what people see and perceive and do and don't understand. In John's Gospel, throughout, light is equated with the incarnation of God, with God made human in the person of Jesus, fully human, fully divine. And sight, the idea of seeing with both the eyes and understanding with the mind and the spirit, is played with. Now, that's in all the Gospels to some extent or another, but especially in John. John really has fun with it in a lot of ways. So we have these metaphors of light and sight for how people come to and respond to the presence of Christ, the teachings and work of Christ. John uses the metaphors of blindness and sight in particular to communicate this. Now, this is not to be confused with any kind of reflection on the state of disability of physical sight and physical blindness. John encounters a blind man, or tells the encounter of Jesus' encounter with the blind man, and he refutes the idea that the blindness of this man is some kind of punishment for something he did or something his parents did. It's just something that's happened. And instead, he heals the man, and the whole story of the man born blind is a set of ironic contrasts. The ones who should be able to see who Jesus is, to perceive the light, the ones who are the religious leadership of that time, cannot see it at all. They are blind. They are more blind than the blind man in the ways that they reject Jesus, that they try to undermine his teachings, that they accuse the man who was born blind, who could not see and now he could see, of lying. They are supposed to get it, and they don't. They are ironic victims. Now, I want to say something about irony and ironic victims. John uses the tool of irony, the rhetorical tool of irony, in a very distinctive way throughout this gospel. So what is irony? Irony is when something that should be a certain way is instead another way. And let me tell you a story to illuminate that. When I was in seminary in my New Testament class, we were studying this gospel, and we were talking about irony and ironic victims, how the ones who were supposed to get it didn't, and the ones who you never thought would get the truth do indeed. And one of my classmates was having a terrible time with it. It just seemed to not be able to be grasped by her what irony exactly is, even though she knew it on some internal level. She just couldn't define it. And we finally took a break, and we got in the car and we went off to get some lunch. On the road, we've passed on the highway an auto repair vehicle, one of those emergency responder vehicles with the flasher bar on the top and everything else, painted all over with roadside aid, with a broken axle, lights flashing, little caution cones out around it. And that was irony. The thing that was supposed to repair and restore others is itself broken. And she said, "Oh, okay, I get it now." I hope you do too. In the gospel, there are many who are caught up in irony. They should get it, but they don't, like the religious leaders. They can't understand what Jesus is saying, like Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus at night and is a teacher of the law and is so literal about being born again that he cannot figure out how a person could go back in their mother's womb and be reborn. Meanwhile, the ones who are supposedly foolish, and the last and the least, especially the women, especially in John's gospel, the women always seem to get it, are the ones who do get it. So the disciples are filled with confusion when they see Jesus talking with the woman at the well, this woman who's been married multiple times, this woman who is herself an outcast in the broad daylight of noon. They don't get it. They don't understand what Jesus is telling them, whereas she goes and starts to bring more people to Christ. To make this point, John over and over again takes the people who are allegedly wise and makes them into ironic victims to lead readers, to lead us into the upside down nature of the kingdom of God, where the last are first, where the least among the people are the greatest among people. The idea of new light and new life breaking forth, of Jesus coming into the world to open eyes and shine light into our darkness, is one that we celebrate on Christmas Eve, and that's probably what most of you associate that passage from John 1 that I read. But this is a truth that we need to celebrate every single day. Jesus has come not only to heal the blindness of these people in the past, but to heal our own blindness as well. Sometimes we are the ironic victims. We think we're walking around in the light, but we need to be led out of our darkness and into the light of God's love. Our work as Jesus' followers is to remember how easily our wisdom can be proven to be foolish, and then to understand how the things that we think are foolish can be proved to be wise. That's a theme that Paul will elaborate on the epistles. We'll talk about that at some future lecture, I hope. Meanwhile, I hope that you'll take a trip back through the fourth gospel. Just kind of page through, look at those stories, look for references to light and sight. Make note of who is in the darkness and who comes into the light of day. I'll give you two more that you can look for in the story that we're going to be preaching and teaching about over the next few weeks on Sunday mornings at 10:30. Nicodemus is one, a teacher of the law who comes to Jesus at night, in the dark, for fear of being found out, for fear of what he doesn't know. After Jesus' crucifixion, comes with Joseph of Arimathea and helps to take Jesus' body off the cross and off to burial. Out of the dark and into the light comes Nicodemus, in acknowledgement of who Jesus is. The other one I want to leave you with is the Easter story itself. Of course, the women go to the tomb, the women who are never believed, and they don't find the body there. They rush off to tell the apostles what's happened, and the apostles think it's idle gossip. Mary Magdalene stays behind. She just can't believe it. She's crying. They're in the garden at dawn, and Jesus comes to her and speaks her name, and she perceives, her eyes are opened, and she sees that this is not the gardener, but Jesus himself with her. She has seen the light. She has come into the light. Peter has his own special story of darkness and light, doesn't he? In the darkness of Jesus' time of trial, as we'll be thinking about in Holy Week, Peter stands in the courtyard and denies Jesus. And so by the time that Easter Sunday comes around, Peter isn't even sure if he's still a disciple. Peter isn't sure if he wants to be a disciple. And finally, he goes back to Galilee and says, let's go fishing. I'm going fishing. And he goes out as if he could return to the life he once had. Out there in the darkness, he can't catch any fish until at dawn, a man on the beach calls out and says, throw your net over the other side. And there's an enormous catch of fish. And Peter realizes in the dawning of the light that standing on the beach by a fire is Jesus. And he jumps out of the boat and goes to Jesus and is received and is commissioned to go and feed Jesus' sheep, to go and take care of Jesus' people. He is commissioned to be one of the prime apostles, prime sharers of the good news. So I hope that you will remember these things. I hope as we think of the Easter story, you'll see who's in the dark and who's in the light, who's in the physical dark and the physical light, who's in the spiritual dark and the spiritual light. And I hope that you will find your own journey to light and life and love. Remember in all these things that the Bible is ancient and ambiguous and diverse. It is many voices from a time long past, and it is unlike our own times, calling out to us from the past to see the work of God, to see the light in the stories within, so that we can then perceive, so we can see the work of God, the light of God in our own world. So I hope that you will find this enlightening, literally. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts. You can share them in the comments. You can shoot me a direct message, or I'm hoping to be able to schedule a Zoom discussion time of some of these themes. Meanwhile, as we move towards Easter, towards Holy Week, towards all of the things that are yet to happen in the Gospel of John, may the God of light and sight be with you, illuminating your path and opening your eyes to the good news of grace, reconciliation, and compassion. May God be with you till we meet again.